If you have followed along in our Podcast SEO mini-series, then by now you might be feeling really excited to use Podcast SEO for your podcast, as you should be, because 1 in 2 listeners out there right now are utilizing search to find a podcast like yours. But there are 2 big mistakes that I see podcasters making when it comes to Podcast SEO, which causes them to waste their time and which causes their Podcast SEO strategy to underperform. So in this episode, we're going to break down exactly how to tell if your Podcast SEO efforts are paying off, how quickly you can expect to see results for your podcast, and the exact metrics you need to track to know that it's working. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. So if you didn't catch the Podcast SEO episodes before this one, I highly recommend you listen to those too, because in those episodes, we walked through why Podcast SEO can be such a game changer for independent podcasts and why now is the time to jump on this strategy. Because the way that listeners are looking for podcasts is changing. No longer is it just word of mouth recommendations. No longer is it just browsing the charts. Primarily, listeners are finding new shows to listen to in search, inside of Apple and inside of Spotify or whatever app that they use to listen to your podcast. And if your show is not showing up in search, then what's happening is that the competitors of yours who are showing up in search are capturing those listeners. We also broke down how quickly you can expect to get results from this strategy compared to other podcast marketing strategies that you could try or that you probably have tried by now. Which brings us to this episode where we're going to break down how to know whether your podcast SEO efforts are paying off. Because at the end of the day, none of us want to waste time on a task that's not going to pay off in some way. Human psychology demands a payoff, whatever that payoff might be. And in some cases, that payoff is instant, like the clear counter that I have after I load the dishwasher. Or is it stack the dishwasher? I don't know. Maybe you can help my family settle this debate because we can't decide and we can't agree. But in any case, other times there are long-term payoffs, such as seeing a stronger, more muscular body when you're consistent in going to the gym. But before we get into how long the payoff can take when it comes to podcast SEO or what to track to make sure that it's working for your show, we need to talk about consistency here. Because the biggest mistake that I see podcasters make is thinking that they can set this up once and that they're done. Podcast SEO doesn't work like that. I want you to think of it more as an infinite loop. It is an ongoing process where you are optimizing, you are tracking and testing, then you are refining your strategy, and then you're rinsing and repeating. Now, it sounds relatively simple, but without a working knowledge of SEO, this can often feel overwhelming for podcast hosts. They jump in with both feet, they're excited about utilizing the strategy, they figure out, okay, these are the keywords that I'm going to start utilizing, and then they just utilize those keywords without actually knowing how to look behind the scenes to see the impact that it's making on their show. And let's be fair, this is actually true across the board when it comes to any and all marketing tactics that you could be utilizing for your podcast. I talk to podcast hosts all the time who are like, Courtney, well, I've been podcast guesting, but I don't know if it's working. Or I've been posting on social media, but I'm really not seeing results. I'm like, well, what do you mean in terms of results? They're like, well, my download numbers aren't moving. I'm like, okay, hold on. Let's take a step back. We need to go deeper than downloads here. Because in all cases, downloads are only going to scratch the surface in terms of what's actually happening with your podcast, in terms of the true health of your podcast and your podcast's true ability to attract, keep, and convert listeners. So a lot of podcasters start off strong with this strategy because they're excited, but then after a certain point in time, they abandon this strategy because they stop seeing results and then they scratch their head and they wonder, well, why am I not showing up in search anymore? But it's kind of like going to the gym. If you start going to the gym and you have never gone to the gym before and you start lifting weights, then you are going to see some quick wins. You are going to see, they call them newbie gains. I remember when I started my weightlifting journey, I had so many newbie gains and I'm like, this is amazing. I love lifting weights. This is awesome. This is so easy. And I was like on cloud nine and I was just excited about it and I would show up to the gym. After a certain point in time, let me tell you what, those newbie gains stopped coming. And I was like, well, this sucks. I hate this. These things are heavy. I don't want to go to the gym and pick up all this stuff. And so it was harder to stay consistent when I wasn't seeing those quick wins. Well, now 3+ years later into my weightlifting journey, I'm really glad that I stuck with it. Was I as consistent as I wanted to be? Was I perfect with my consistency? No, absolutely not. Have I seen long-term gains and body composition changes? 100%, because I stuck with it even after those quick wins were gone. So podcast SEO is the same way. You are going to see quick wins, which is exciting. But if you don't maintain it over the long run, then you are going to lose any progress that you've made. In other words, you won't reap the long-term gains and you'll also lose the short-term gains. Just like had I stopped going to the gym at that point, not only would I not have seen those body comp changes, I also would have lost the newbie gains that I had gained. So podcast SEO is the same. Another thing that I see podcast hosts make the mistake of doing is thinking that this is something they can hand off to their team to do for them. The problem with that is that most teams don't have the deep podcast SEO knowledge needed to refine a podcast SEO strategy because the rankings are shifting consistently. The podcast players are updating, their algorithms are changing. Your competitors out there right now are shifting and changing and pivoting. So without knowing how to monitor something like this ongoing and knowing what adjustments to make, any hard-won progress that you've earned can also be lost just as quickly. It's kind of like having a personal trainer, right? Where it's like you can go to the gym and you can do some workouts on your own and you can do some bicep curls and maybe some squats, but guess what? You might injure yourself. You might not see the results that you want to see because you're not really sure what the heck you're supposed to be doing. You might not be lifting heavy enough. It could be a number of things that could be affecting your ability to see results with that quote unquote strategy of going to the gym and lifting weights. So just like a personal trainer would build a strategy for you to be able to say, here's what you need to do in order to see the results that you're here to get, right? Which might be different for you than it is for someone else. And same is true for your podcast because no two podcasts are alike. That is where having a team of experts behind you to come in and say, hey, here's what the recommendation would be for your podcast based on your goals for your show can help you save a ton of time and a ton of money in the long run. Because what happens is for those that want to outsource it to their team, they're like, okay, here's how to do it. Go figure it out. Let's just kind of figure it out as we go, right? They end up spending more time and more money over the long run because that team doesn't have the working knowledge and the expertise to be able to come in and pinpoint exactly what needs to happen and change, which actually saves time and money in the long run of having to figure it out and trial and error. So the benefit though of podcast SEO, unlike going to the gym, is the fact that your personal trainer can't do your workouts for you. I really wish that could be the case. I'm sitting here looking off in the corner of my office, just imagining, gosh, if my personal trainer could do my workouts for me and I could get the results, that'd be amazing. I would pay any amount of money for that to happen. If I could look like the bodybuilder, but someone else could do my workouts. But with podcast SEO, that is what can happen because you can literally hand this off to someone to not only build a strategy, but also execute it for you so that you reap the rewards and you don't have to do any of the work. Sounds kind of nice, right? I will say this. Our team has collectively invested more than 36,000 hours and over 12 years studying what separates the top shows from the ones that go unnoticed. So if you don't want to spend hours learning podcast SEO and keeping up with it every month, then it can help to have a team of experts in your corner who can literally build this and take it off your plate. And that's why we rolled out our Done For You podcast SEO offer, because we were getting so many notes from people saying, I want to do this for my podcast, but I don't have the time. My team doesn't have the time. Or worse, my team doesn't have the know-how. Can you do it for me? So we were like, actually, yes, we can. We would love to help you with that. And since then, we've been having people signing up for this offer and they're like so excited because they're like, oh my gosh, now I can reap the rewards for my podcast, but I don't even have to do any of the work. So if that's you, you're a serious podcast and you're like, I would love for someone to take this off my plate, click the link in the show notes to sign up or send us an email with your questions and we'd be happy to talk with you about whether it's a fit. On the other side of that though, look, I started my podcast from absolutely nothing. Completely bootstrapped it and grown it to the point where it is now. And if that's you and you just started your show and you're out there DIYing it and you're bootstrapping your show and you don't have a budget to put towards hiring someone to do it for you, I get it. And that's why we created our podcast SEO mini course too, where you can learn how to do it yourself. Just be prepared though to spend a few hours a week on it because there is going to be a learning curve. It's going to take some time to figure out how to analyze your competition. It's going to take some time to build a strategy, to test that strategy, then to review your analytics and to figure out what's working and what's not, and to continue to refine and repeat. So the most important thing, and the point that I'm really working to drill home here, if you haven't noticed, is the fact that podcast SEO is not a one and done thing. But the secret to getting to and then staying at the top of the charts is a commitment to consistently optimizing, consistently testing, consistently refining, and consistently repeating this process. Yes, you're going to see some quick wins. You are going to get those newbie gains. But at a certain point, you will see that start to taper off, and that is when the rubber meets the road, and that is where that consistency gear has to kick in. No different than going to the gym if you want to realize those long-term gains. Or in other words, the longer you keep at it, the greater the payoff that you're going to see. And maybe that's why I'm obsessed with podcast SEO, because it's literally firing all the dopamine pathways in the brain. Quick wins, long-term gains, I don't know, that's a rabbit hole for another day. But in any case, let's break down how to tell if your podcast SEO is actually paying off. Because most podcasters either don't know if it's working, they don't know how to check or where to check, or they check, but they're unknowingly looking at the wrong metrics. So there are 3 things you want to look for. But before we get to that, let's talk about where to check. If you are a serious podcaster who has outsourced your SEO strategy to our team, then you're going to get a monthly report from us that says, here's the gains that you have had this month. Congratulations. Celebrate the 640% increase that you have seen in your podcast SEO over the last 30 days. And yes, that is a real number from one of our clients over the last 30 days who saw some incredible results with their podcast when it comes to SEO. So if that's you, sit back, relax, and look for that report every month. We will send it to you and we'll let you know exactly what to tweak and any keyword changes that you might have. And we'll show you how to optimize for that. Now, if you're DIYing this, I strongly recommend signing up for OSHA's podcast SEO tool. You heard from one of the team members at OSHA, Irene, in the previous episodes. OSHA is hands down the simplest, most effective way to track and see if your podcast SEO results are working, if you're DIYing it. If you're on our Done For You podcast SEO plan, you don't need to sign up for this. We will take care of this for you. But if you are DIYing it, you need to have some sort of way to track. You need to be able to see if your strategy is paying off. And by track, I don't mean log into your hosting provider and see what your last episode downloads were. No. We want to be able to see how your podcast is ranking on Apple and on Spotify, and it requires a different tool to be able to connect your podcast to see how it's ranking, to see what competitors you're ranking against, to see in what positions you're ranking for what keywords, to see in what countries you're ranking. And this might change one day, I don't know, as hosting providers start to capitalize on this opportunity, but right now, OSHA is one of the only platforms that allows you to be able to do this. And they have just made their tool available to independent podcasters. It used to only be available to pro podcasters. It was pretty cost prohibitive, but now it is so easy to sign up. Within 24 hours, you'll be able to see exactly what keywords your show is ranking for inside of Apple and inside of Spotify, and you'll be able to get a clear and complete picture of exactly what to tweak when it comes to your podcast SEO strategy. If you don't fall into either of the categories above, there is one other way that you can check to get a general sense of how your podcast is performing in search, and it's free. And that is typing your keywords into the search bar on Apple and on Spotify and seeing if your show pops up. If your show is not popping up for a given keyword, then you'll want to increase the frequency of that keyword in your podcast metadata or the written messaging of your podcast in order to try and get your podcast to show up for that search term. If you are there and you are ranking, then congratulations, double down. Continue to utilize that keyword, but continue to check on a monthly basis to make sure that you're not falling down in the rankings. You want to be able to stay at the top of those charts. The problem with this strategy is that it's not going to tell you how many listeners are searching for that keyword. So you might have a keyword that you're like, oh my gosh, I'm ranking number 1. This is amazing. But if only like 5 listeners a month are actually searching for that keyword, well, it may not be the best keyword to be optimizing for because, well, not that many people are searching for it. And so it might get you a little bit of progress incrementally, but not the progress that maybe you were expecting to see. So that is the downside of this where, yes, it is free. You can definitely type in those search terms to see if your show is popping up, but you're not going to know if that's actually a good keyword to go after. And that's where some of these podcast SEO specific tools and or having our team just do it for you can definitely come in handy because we're going to be looking at all that. We're not going to be telling you, hey, go after this keyword just because it's easy to rank for. We're going to be saying, hey, these are the keywords that you need to be ranking for because this is the volume of listeners that's searching for this keyword. We want your show popping up for this keyword. And here's how many times you need to be utilizing it, where you need to be utilizing it in the written messaging of your podcast in order to start ranking in the top 5 for it. Now, just again, to be totally transparent, this free option has some limitations. It's a great starting point. If you really can't afford to do anything else, then it is totally fine as a starting point. But it's only going to tell you if you're ranking for that keyword in your own country. It's not going to tell you if and where you're ranking for that keyword in other countries where your ideal target listener might be listening. So again, take this method with a grain of salt and know that, hey, if I'm seeing my show in search, that's great, that's exciting. I don't really know how many listeners are searching for this keyword, but also it's a good sign that I'm showing up. So you can continue to pursue that keyword if you want. And then if and when you're at a point where you can invest a little bit more into your podcast, this is what I would invest in. I would invest in learning how to do podcast SEO well, signing up for a tool that you can utilize to track this specifically and or outsourcing it all together, especially if you're serious about the growth of your podcast over the long term. But look, I was a bootstrapping podcaster once myself, okay? So if that's you, no shame. You are where you are, and that's okay. We all start somewhere. So if you've got no budget, but you still want to utilize this strategy, listen to the episodes that I'm going to link below for you. All right. And use the free method for now to track just to get a general sense of your keyword performance. And speaking of keyword performance, what should you be looking for to know if your podcast SEO strategy is working? And by working, I mean A, getting you to appear in search, and B, getting the listeners who find you to actually listen. Because there is a difference between getting found in search and actually getting clicked on. You know what I mean? So in your search rankings for your key terms on Apple and Spotify, the first question to be asking is, am I showing up for those keyword search terms? You want to be appearing in the top 5 in search for those keywords. And do those keywords have enough volume? In other words, are those keywords that listeners are actually searching for? This is so key to this entire strategy working. The other thing you can look at is your Spotify for Creators conversion stats. So when you log into Spotify for Creators, they have a section back there called Analytics. And if you click in there, you'll see Discovery. And under that Discovery tab, there are 2 figures that they give you, which gives you insight into how your podcast is capturing and converting new listeners. Now, if you're not seeing any stats there, that means your podcast is not getting enough traction to show those numbers. So keep doing what you're doing, keep at it, keep working to grow your podcast. Eventually those numbers will show up. If you are seeing numbers showing up there, then great. The first one that you want to be looking for, so the number to the left, that first percentage, is showing you how many people have seen your show and clicked on it or not. If that number is over 10%, then that means that your podcast packaging is doing pretty well. Are there things that could be optimized when it comes to your gatekeepers, your show name, your cover art, your episode titles, and so forth? Yeah, probably. We can always optimize. We can always tweak. But the baseline stat there is around 10%. We want to see that converting at least 10% of people finding your show to actually clicking through. Now, if they're finding you, but they're not clicking through, this could indicate, well, your SEO strategy might be working, but your packaging is not optimized enough. That listeners are seeing the show, but they're not clicking. They're not noticing that, hey, this show is for me. And we can easily fix that, but that's a different topic for a different episode, okay? Now, that second number there, which is the second conversion percentage, that one is actually showing you how many people clicked into your podcast and actually clicked play. So that's another number that gives us a lot of context for other areas of podcast health. We don't really need to worry about that one when it comes to podcast SEO. The other metric that I'd rather you look at is how many new listeners have found your show over the last 30 days versus how many returning listeners do you have. The problem is, and I'm so mad at Spotify for this, so if anyone wants to make signs and go picket outside of Spotify's headquarters, please join me. I will happily rent the bus and we will drive there. But they took away the raw data that we used to be able to utilize to calculate the new versus returning listener percentage. Now, we are keeping an eye on Apple. We are keeping an eye on Spotify to be able to see if any data, some of the raw data that might not be the most obvious data where you're like, oh, I can calculate the new versus returning listener percentage from these numbers. But we're keeping an eye to see if they give us that raw data back in any way, shape, or form so that we can calculate this. As of this point in time, the only way to do this is with a third-party tool. There are a couple of tools out there. There's a new one that just launched that is free to independent podcasters, so I would recommend signing up for it. I'll put a link in the show notes for that. There's another one that is a paid tool that is a little bit higher in terms of the monthly cost. However, it does provide really, really, really insightful analytics. So if you're an analytics nerd, and I mean that in a good way, you really want to dig into the data of your podcast, this might be one to look at. We'll link both in the show notes for you. But essentially, this is going to give you information to show you exactly how many new listeners your show is converting. Now, again, you can kind of get a general sense of this from what's happening within your Spotify metrics. But if you really want to know how many new listeners your show is attracting and how many of those listeners are staying around, which gives you the complete picture of how listeners are finding you through SEO, are they clicking through? Are they staying? All of this is key information to have to growing your audience. Then this is another metric that you'll want to be tracking. Now, one other thing that you could potentially look at here, and again, this is just a general directional metric, but that's your month-over-month growth. And I've walked through at length how to calculate this in other episodes that I'll link below for you. But essentially, we are tracking the total downloads this month compared to the total downloads last month, and that percentage increase from month to month. Now, this is one you want to track for at least 90 days because this is a trailing indicator. It can take a few months of diligent podcast marketing efforts to see this trend line moving in the direction that you want it to go. All right, so these are some metrics that you can be looking at beyond your per episode downloads, which is going to tell you nothing about how your SEO strategy is actually performing. So the most important takeaway here, podcast SEO is very effective compared to other podcast marketing strategies that you could be doing for your podcast. So much so that podcast SEO is a mandatory baseline for any podcast growth plan that we build for a client or that we teach a client how to build for themselves. It's so simple, in fact, that it is almost set and forget. So simple that I want to make sure you're not missing the most important part of this whole process. Because unlike the crock pot that I depend on to make sure my boys actually get fed, podcast SEO isn't a set and forget it task. Not quite. It's a strategic loop. Optimize, test and track, refine, repeat. Most podcasters skip the track part. That's the piece we just walked through. They dabble in it without really giving it a chance, and then they abandon it to chase the next shiny object. And then they wonder why they're struggling to grow their podcast. But not you. Because now you know that not only will podcast SEO give you a virtually instant result, those newbie gains, it's also cumulative, which means that the podcasters who apply this strategy diligently and intentionally usually start seeing measurable improvements in 90 days or less and over the long term. Because then once it's in place, think about it this way. As the foundation of your podcast marketing strategy, any other podcast growth tactic that you layer on, whether that be guesting, ads, social, email, cross-promotion, any and all of it, is going to help you drive more of the right traffic. Because again, that is one of the top things I hear from podcasters is that they're putting all this effort in, but they have no way of knowing if it's paying off or not. So I am a huge fan of closing that loop and putting the proper tracking mechanisms in place to know how listeners are converting at the 3 places that they need to be converting when it comes to your show. From cold listener to new listener, from new listener to your email list, and from email list to client or customer if you have a business behind the podcast, or if not, you'll want to definitely optimize for the first 2 because those 2 things, audience size and extended total reach through your email list and other platforms, is going to be most valuable to potential sponsors. So obviously, if you have any questions about podcast SEO, please feel free to shoot us an email. Look in the show notes for that info. My team would be happy to help you or point you in the right direction. And speaking of podcast growth, if you have listened to this show for any length of time, then you have definitely heard me say that the 2 key components of podcast growth are attracting new listeners to your show and then retaining those listeners, getting them to actually click play and keep listening. Otherwise, you're just going to have a leaky bucket where listeners are coming in one door and they're leaving out the other just as quick as they find you. So in the next episode, I have got a very special guest and dear friend of mine in the industry joining us to show you how to plug those holes and to keep listeners listening longer to your show. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy. Remember that second conversion percentage. The second conversion percentage. Okay, the second conversion percentage. Let's try that one again.